Let's get it started. Okay. As you know, our test on Friday is going to be on 13, 14, 15, and 16, right? 13, chapter 13, starts with the political aftermath. I shouldn't say the political aftermath of the War of 1812. The political aftermath of the era of good feelings. So, we know this. In the aftermath of the War of 1812, there was a period of time that we called the era of good feelings. In that time period, the Federalist Party, which had been the party of Washington, the party of Adams, the party of Hamilton, faded on a national level. And the Republican Party, which had been the party of Jefferson and the party of Madison, had really come to dominate national politics. Now, if you read a little bit about this, your textbook and other, what is this large thing here? Is that, imagine that, all right? Yes, your textbook talks that there are some political controversies during the time, to be certain, but there's no organized opposition to James Monroe in his re-election in 1820. However, in 1824, there are 4 candidates for President of the United States. Let me point something out. Of the 4 candidates for President of the United States in 1824, only one of them was formally nominated by the caucus of Republicans, and that was William Crawford. So Crawford is the Georgian nominated by the caucus of Republican representatives in Congress, and the caucus of Federalists had been the way that candidates were nominated by the fledgling parties. Crawford was the caucus candidate. John Quincy Adams, right, was the current Secretary of State under Monroe. He is nominated for the presidency. Henry Clay, who was the seated Speaker of the House, is nominated for the presidency, as is Andrew Jackson, who is the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. So in the election of 24, there are 4 candidates for president. All of them claim to be Republicans. Now, the result of the election, let me put it this way. What's the result of the election for president in 1824? It's a trick question, Jason. You were alive, Jason. Remember, you were in a period you were detached, but now you're refocused, right? So, what was the result of the election?
Well, technically speaking, Jackson wins, but he didn't get the majority,
So, could we say this, Jason, that the election was inconclusive, right? That no one was elected by the Electoral College to be president in 1824. No candidate got the majority of votes. Who got the most votes, but not the majority? Who got the most votes, but not the majority in 24? Jackson, right? Now, in 24, only about 24% of eligible voters actually cast ballots for president. I mean, the whole Jacksonian popular democracy is not fully launched yet. I mean, you're moving in that direction, and Jackson is a symbol of it. Now, eventually, the Congress, the House of Representatives, votes to name John Quincy Adams to be the president. But there's controversy over that, right? In fact, the results of the congressional vote are described by the critics of Henry Clay and the critics of John Quincy Adams as being a corrupt bargain. Why was it described? What made the bargain corrupt? Go ahead, Joe.
Henry Clay was named Secretary of State when John Quincy Adams got into office. And since the Secretary of State was like always the ex-president, and they thought it was a deal between.
So the center of the corrupt bargain is that Henry Clay is named by Adams to be Secretary of State, correct? Now, what was Clay's role in the Congress that elected Adams? What was Clay? He was the Speaker of the House. And so what was argued is that Clay used his influence as Speaker of the House to get Adams elected president by the House in return for being named Secretary of State, which was generally seen as the successor to the president. Now, the Jackson people described that as a corrupt bargain, and that haunted both Clay and Adams through their entire political careers. But Adams is elected to the presidency, and when he is elected to the presidency, he takes office. He doesn't have much success, but really, what does he want to do? What's Adams's overall agenda? I mean, anybody remember? We didn't talk much about it, but go ahead, Joel. The American system would be a good way of putting it, just for fun. When we talk, Darius, about the American system, what are we talking about?
The internal trade with other sectors of the United States.
Yeah, that's a fair enough response. What Darius said is internal trade with other sectors of the United States. But what I compared the American system to was the Atlantic system. The United States was part of the Atlantic system of trade. Things happened in the United States, and we traded with Europe for other things, and in the Caribbean, and a triangular kind of trade. And on some level, many felt that we had been burned by being part of the Atlantic system. And that's what contributes to the embargoes and the War of 1812 and the problems with Europe in general. And so Clay and others are going to propose an American system. And what makes the American system controversial is, in order to implement it, an active government is necessary, right? I mean, to have the American system, in order to enhance the sectors of the country and to connect them economically, what the advocates argued for was government-financed internal improvements. They argued for a national bank to provide a reliable currency, and protective tariffs to protect the kind of burgeoning industrial sector of New England. And I think as we went further in the course, not in the course, in our discussion, and talked about chapter 14 in the internal development of the United States, you start to see where the American system ideology comes into place. But I mean, we could describe Adams as being a nationalist. He wants the power of the national government to be used to build the country. And that seems out of step with the direction that the country is going with, and Adams has weak political skills, and so the result is that Adams doesn't have much success, and the stage is set for Jackson's election in 28. Now, Jackson is triumphantly elected in 28, and his election becomes symbolic. I mean, Jackson is different than the average American president. The average American president, well, I shouldn't say the average, the typical American president up to that point had been somebody that had been well-educated and highly experienced in government, someone who seemed to appear to be inevitably moving into that position. Washington is inevitable. Adams is inevitable. Jefferson is inevitable. Madison's inevitable. And even Monroe, and even John Quincy Adams, on some level, is inevitable. They're inevitable because it appears that their background, their experience, their pedigree, their disposition prepares them for the position. Jackson is not like that. Jackson represents kind of the Western common man ascending to the position of president. And we said really what symbolizes Jackson's kind of election is his inauguration. And we talked a little bit about all of the people coming to Washington to watch him be inaugurated, to wish him well at his inaugural ball, and the results of that inaugural ball. Now, when we get into Jackson's administration, several things will be on the test. One is his actions with patronage and the spoils system. What do we mean? Sean, you are a student of the spoils system when you are conscious every now and then, right? But in those few lucid moments, when you're not dozing, Sean, what is your understanding of the spoils system? What does it involve generally? When we talk about Jackson kind of starting the spoils system, what's involved with it? Good.
Banks.
No, not banks, not banks. Yeah, go ahead, Antonio.
There's like when he became presidency, like put all his friends in
So it's about appointing people into governmental offices, right? And go ahead, Nate.
It's like basically putting their people in subdivisions so we can keep them in mind, and also have their policies passed instead of ours.
So then the jobs that are, there were 10,000 jobs, Sylvia, that were available to government, right? So 10,000 governmental jobs. And Jackson established as somewhat of a precedent by removing 1,000 people who held those jobs and replacing those people with people who were loyal to him. And he what term does Jackson use to defend it? Yeah, go ahead. Rotation in office. His critics called it the spoil system. And on some level they argued it was a way for Jackson to increase his power. That he would reward his supporters, which would encourage them to support him more, and to use their power in these governmental positions to reinforce Jackson's will and ideology. So the spoil system becomes sort of controversial, right, in Jackson's administration. Well, probably the two most controversial things, well, three controversial things in Jackson's administration. One is certainly Indian removal. Indian removal is this huge controversy which eventually is addressed with the Indian Removal Act, 1830. What did the Indian Removal Act do? What did that do? What ultimately is the issue in Indian removal, and what does the Indian Removal Act do? Go ahead, Sylvia. Now that you are sitting up straight, you will have a better chance of answering this correctly. Go ahead.
Didn't it go against what the Supreme Court had ruled out?
Well, eventually, yes, eventually, but yes, go ahead.
It forced the Indians west of the Mississippi.
Yes, it provided for the maybe forcible removal of Native Americans who had been, what states really were involved in this? Yeah, go ahead, Jason. Georgia was the center of it, and the tribes were the Cherokee, the Creek, the civilized tribes of Georgia. And, ultimately, just not to belabor, but the original idea was that the Indians had to civilize or move. Well, the Cherokees civilized to the point where the Cherokees proved their level of civilization by actually owning slaves themselves. Did you read that? I mean, did the Cherokee actually own slaves? So they proved their level of civilization by doing that. And despite their level of civilization, Georgians want the land. And so Jackson responds to that by having Congress pass the Indian Removal Act, which forcibly moved the Native Americans out of those lands. Now, somebody mentioned that the Native Americans are going to challenge the actions of Georgia in court, and the Supreme Court is going to uphold their challenge, which Jackson promptly ignores. What is the disturbing culmination of Jackson's Indian removal program? The Trail of Tears. And the Trail of Tears kind of symbolizes the forceful removal of those Native Americans. We spent a lot of time talking about the nullification crisis, right? Here's an interesting question. How does the controversy that ends in the nullification crisis start? How does it start? Go ahead, Alan. No, go ahead, Dave.
Tariffs, that's okay.
You could say that. You could say that, but I want to even go before that a little bit. I can't disagree with high tariffs. I mean, tariffs are a part of it. But the initial, Senator Foote of Connecticut starts it with what? Can anybody remember the sequence of events? Yeah, go ahead. No, not the Hartford Convention. No, go ahead, Jason.
Wasn't it something about like expanding westward?
Yeah, Western expansion. Stopping the survey of Western lands. And then into the picture comes Hayne and the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Who wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest? Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Ellis. My mind went blank for a second. Go ahead, Ellis. I'm not used to seeing your eyes open, but go ahead. Go ahead.
John C. Calhoun.
Yes, exactly. John C. Calhoun wrote it in 28. When Calhoun wrote the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, what position did he hold, Darius?
He held that slavery.
No. I mean, what governmental position?
That the Union
No. What did he do for a living? What was his job?
That didn't come, but
Yeah.
he was vice president.
He was the vice president, right? He was the vice president, right? So Calhoun wrote it anonymously as vice president. But now, there, as you started, I think you were moving in the right direction. What did he hold? You know, what was his idea?
That slavery is constant.
No. That was today.
Okay.
Yeah, that was today. Now, remember, I confined you to a one-word answer. You got mad? Right? Yeah.
I didn't get mad.
Yes, a little bit mad. But no, that was today. Remember, his position in the South Carolina Exposition, there's a question about this. His position in the South Carolina Exposition and protest was that the Constitution was a compact among the states, and that the states could ultimately interpret it, right? And that they would interpret the Constitution in special conventions that could be called by the state legislature. So what Calhoun said is, look, ultimately, the constitutionality of federal law can be evaluated or judged by special conventions. And really, the purpose of the South Carolina Exposition and protest, and we talked about this, was to give states veto power over federal actions that they thought might hurt them. And, you know, you mentioned something about the Hartford Convention. The Hartford Convention was an example of New England doing that, right? So okay, now South Carolina proposes the same kind of veto power. What was the issue that they wanted to stop? They wanted veto power over some such sorts of federal laws. What federal laws, what things that the federal government were doing that South Carolina saw trouble? Good ones.
The protective tariff.
Yes. Protective tariffs that are a part of the American system, which the Southern Carolinians, remember what I said today? That the South was producing 75% of the cotton for who? England, right? So here are Southerners exporting cotton to England, right? England is less able to sell their finished products to Americans, right? So England has fewer dollars. South doesn't like that, right? And then the products that are finished in the United States, Southerners have to buy at higher prices, and they have fewer dollars to buy it with. So they say these tariffs are unfair to our section of the country, but we can't stop them. So we can't stop them in the legislature, so we'll stop them with nullification, right? And eventually we said that South Carolina goes ahead in the aftermath of the election of 1832. The legislature calls a nullification convention, and they actually nullify a federal law. How does the controversy end? What happens? How does the controversy end? Let's see, let's get somebody else. Yes, go ahead. Yes, there is a compromise. What is it? Tariffs will be reduced gradually, right? You know, and South Carolina agrees to the gradual reduction in tariffs. Congress passes the force bill, but it's unnecessary. And South Carolina, they nullify the force bill, right? And remember, we discussed this, and in our discussion of it, we concluded that there might not have been a clear winner. That some of you said that Jackson won, and some of you said that South Carolina won, and your textbook argues the Union won. But, you know, identifying a clear winner was difficult. The third issue that we wanted to talk about in Jackson's administration is the Bank of the United States. Now, in terms of the Bank of the United States, the Bank of the United States had been chartered in 1860 for a 20-year period. That bank was largely privately owned, but the United States government kept its money there. So what gave the Bank of the United States its influence were the deposits of the U.S. government, which were deposited in that bank for the safety of the institution. That man has a question, yes.
How would they be able to, like, put more money after they start depositing? Can they just, like, start spending?
Well, you're a little ahead of me, but I mean, when the government would expend, I mean, they would use the bank like you used the bank. They deposited money and they made payments. And so if you don't deposit any more money and you make payments, eventually all your money's gone, right? So anyways, what was at issue in Jackson's administration, interestingly enough, early, was whether or not to recharter the bank for another 20 years. So it had been chartered for 20 years. It was due to go out of existence in 1836. The question was whether or not to recharter it for another 20 years. Now, that question was raised in the Congress in the summer of 1832. Why? Why was the issue of rechartering the bank raised early? Go ahead, Alice.
It's because Henry Clay wanted to be an issue for the 1832 election.
Yes, there was a hope that this would provide an issue for Clay. So are you saying to me that in the election of 1832, Andrew Jackson was running for re-election as a Democrat against Henry Clay, who was the National Republican? Is that what you are saying to me, Ellis? And are you saying to me that Clay and Webster, his fellow National Republican, hoped to make rechartering the bank an issue? Did the bill that would have rechartered the bank pass, Shane, through both houses of Congress in the summer of 32? It did. So the question was, would Jackson veto it? What did he do, Marianne?
He said it was unconstitutional.
And therefore he vetoed it. He said it was unconstitutional, but was that the only reason he vetoed it? Yes, go ahead, Charlie. He didn't like the bank or think it was a good idea. Right? So it's not a good idea. I don't like the bank. I think it's unconstitutional. In fact, if we read his veto message, he had a lot of reasons why he did that. Now, what did we say was significant about Jackson's bank veto? I mean, this idea, Sean, this is the happiest moment of my life. Go ahead. Birth my child in this guy. Yeah, he's overriding kind of the Supreme Court's decision to deem the bank constitutional. And so to some extent, the bank veto is seen as an overextension of the power of the president. You know, and there are other examples of that. Many of you wrote about this in your essays. You know, that Jackson attempted to use the power of the presidency beyond what was intended. Therefore, he disrupted the balance of power and did not defend the Constitution as he allegedly did, right? As his supporters allegedly argued that he did. And the bank veto is a good example of it. The bank veto is sustained, but Jackson attempts to kill the bank, even though it's not going to be recharged. Oh, who was the president of the bank? Yes, Nicholas Biddle, right? And what does Jackson do in order to try to kill the bank? Go ahead, Joe.
He wants to take all the money out of the bank.
Yes, he doesn't have any success in doing that. And in attempting to remove all the deposits from the bank, he has to reshuffle his cabinet once, and the second time he has to fire a seated Secretary of Treasury before he finds someone who won't withdraw the money, but just won't put any more money in. When the government stops depositing money into the Bank of the United States, George, where do they deposit their money? What did he say? Into individual pet banks. How are pet banks described? I mean, what were pet banks? You are right, pet banks. Christian, what were the pet banks?
They were like banks where certain banks would get money from groups like the United States.
What did he say? Wormsy, what did he say? I didn't hear it.
That they deposited money into like smaller local banks.
Yes, local banks. And what was characteristic of those local banks? Go ahead,
Were
Mary.
they supporters of Jackson?
Yes, they were supporters of Jackson. Right? That's why they were called pet banks. Now, remember we said whether this was good or bad is certainly controversial. Jackson, like everything else in Jackson's administration, his defenders will defend this as being things that are done to root out privilege, to promote economic opportunity, to make things equal. Yes?
These pet banks use hard currency or
No, they created paper money. And that created that boom. Now, eventually, when Jackson retires from the presidency in 36, there are two firm political parties. Remember, we said three things are true of the legacy of Jacksonian democracy politically. I hope I can remember them. One is a two-party system, right? A two-party system. And, you know, a solidified second phase of the two-party system. I mean, you had the first phase, you had the Federalists and the Republicans. Then you have the era of good feeling. Now you have the Whigs and the Democrats, right? And the Democrats were followers of Andrew Jackson and basically supporters of limited government, right? The Whigs, what unified the Whigs more than anything? Yes, hatred for Jackson. So it was a collection of people who hated Jackson for different reasons. Remember, the Whigs aren't even going to nominate someone at 36. So that was the first two-party system. What was the second? The three things. One was a two-party system. Two was, I'm trying to picture this in my notes. Yes, yes. Oh yeah, popular democracy, wider participation, you know, and that involves universal manhood suffrage and wider participation. And what was the third? Yes, go ahead.
Popular participation.
Popular participation, we just mentioned that. What else do you have written?
Modern campaign.
Oh, modern campaigning. Modern campaigning. Who was elected president in 1840? Yes. No, Van Buren is 36. William Henry Harrison. First Whig to be elected president. Okay, now, after we talked about the rise of the common man in politics, the Jacksonian era, Jackson and the big events, which, you know, we covered pretty thoroughly and you wrote papers about, which entails chapter 13. We move then to kind of the economic transformation, economic and social and demographic transformation of America during this period. Now, in terms of that, we say the big transformation was the transformation from rural agrarian to urban industrial. And in that second part, you get the big two changes. The big two changes are urban industrial. That America moves to the city, right? Urbanization means that increasing numbers of people rapidly flocked into urban areas and cities grew in size and in influence in the United States. And this was a significant change. I mean, people from the countryside and people from the city look at the world differently. Go out to Westmoreland County sometime, right? I mean, it's a different place, you know, than it is in Pittsburgh. So, look, the city and country were different. Now if you have a kind of transformation where you have urban areas booming and the countryside, people coming from the countryside, this is a significant transformation. Now, we said also to add to that was the rapid immigration. And of course, Marston, what were the two big ethnic groups that flocked into urban areas and into the United States in general during this time period? Irish and Germans. Why did so many Irish leave Ireland in 1845? Look at all, Marissa, look at all the hands that are here to answer that question. Go ahead. Oh, we love the potato famine. Do we not? Mr. Whelan still laments the potato famine when his people fled in large numbers to come to the United States, and not only the United States, other places as well. Because people were fleeing Ireland because of the potato famine, what was distinctive about these Irish immigrants? Two things we said are going to distinguish Irish immigrants over other types of immigrants. Go ahead, Sylvia.
They were Catholics.
Yes, they were Catholics. And they were also what, Jason? Poor. So a large number of very poor, unskilled, impoverished, unskilled Roman Catholics flocked into the United States. Because of the conditions of their immigration, well, I guess I answered my questions. I would say, why did they stay in the cities? Because of the conditions of their immigration, right? That's why they stayed in the cities, because they didn't have enough money to get out. So the Irish, flocked to urban areas like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, and stayed there, and made a big influence on those cities. The German immigration is somewhat different. How so? Go ahead, Joe.
They had the money to go.
Yes. The Germans are going to have more, more money when they come. So why do they leave Germany? Go ahead, Darius. Yeah, I mean, what Darius said is, I guess you could say political repression. He said the failed liberal revolutions of 1848, political repression. Yes, go ahead.
What they looks like could be out fun because the industrialization was already has a foothold in Europe and Germany was the main center.
Yeah, well, I think the Germans too, when you talk about getting out, they are able to spread out in America further. And they have more success in America than the Irish do, at least initially. Now, when people who are already here respond negatively to rapid immigration, what did we call that? What do we call that? That phenomenon is nativism. So nativism is the negative response of native-born Americans to foreign immigration. Nativism. Now, urbanization and immigration is one movement. The other movement is industrialization. And we made the point that industrialization is building and operating factories. What was the first type of factory to be established? Go ahead, Joel.
Textile factory.
Textile. What section of the country? Joel?
England.
New England. Was it in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, that the first textile factory in the United States? Well, could it have been Pawtucket, Rhode Island? Now, you do know that James Watson is fictional. He did not know that. He kept looking for James Watson. Well, you won't find him. You might find him on Facebook, because I had this notion several years ago that kids could do a Facebook page, and that didn't work out. But it's still there, right? The James Watson Facebook page is still there. So James Watson is a fictional textile owner, right? But that's where the textile industry begins, right? In Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And we talked about textiles, we talked about factories, we talked about the growth of factories. And I think what we argue is the economic transformation, the demographic transformation that occurs during this time period is greatly influenced by a number of factors. Maybe the largest is the transportation revolution. So factories spring up. People move to cities, right, for a number of reasons. And we tried to connect them. But one of the biggest reasons was a transportation revolution. What would you say the three big parts of the transportation revolution were? Three big things. Say one, Joel. Steam. Say another, Wormsy.
Rubber.
Say another. Oh, you hit the hard one. Erie, he said the Erie canals. So I would say that, there's also roads and turnpikes, and there might be a question on the test about that. But certainly the bigger question is about the steamboats, Robert Fulton, the steamboat. How did that improve transportation? Between what and what? Go ahead.
They were able to go upstream and they were able to increase transportation by getting cargo upriver. What's that? Yes, up the river, right? Up the river is south to the north, in most cases, right? So it facilitates south-north transportation. What do the railroads and canals connect? Not south-north as much as, say, Jason, west-east. Most famous is my personal favorite. I couldn't find enough questions I liked about the Erie Canal. There's one on there, though.
which is my personal favorite, the Erie Canal. Well, I'm not going to tell you, right? Because then you would know. But now you know that there is a question about the Erie Canal. No, it is not about how long it is. Although, when you're on Jeopardy someday, and you get that right, you're welcome. Now, okay, so we talked about the relationship between transportation improvements and industrialization. We talked about other actions the government may have taken or not taken in terms of industrialization. And we mentioned that industrialization was a part of the larger emergence of the market revolution. And that the market revolution represented a dramatic change in the way that people lived, right? A change in the way that people worked. And we said that those changes, industrialization, urbanization, westward expansion, the market revolution, are going to spawn a response. Now, one of the things, and there's a question on the test, and this is something that we didn't talk about in class. One of the things, we did talk about this, we did talk about the distinction between home and work. And we said, when the market revolution occurs and there's a separation between home and work, that there are separate spheres. Men work, women stay home. There was a notion called the cult of domesticity. The cult of domesticity. And the cult of domesticity is this idea that the woman is superior in the sphere of the home. That the woman's job was to promote that sphere. The cult of domesticity. We argued today and the day before that that the changes that occurred during this time period, industrialization, urbanization, the changes in the nature of work, the market revolution, transportation, generated anxiety and optimism. Now, in response to that anxiety and optimism comes this flowering of reform. What inspires the reform is the Second Great Awakening and the Romantic impulse. There are several questions on the test about the Second Great Awakening. The nature of the Second Great Awakening, the idea, the ideology, but the central ideology, it's an evangelical movement, outdoor speakers, emotional, but remember this, the idea was that anybody could be saved, equality. Who was the most, who do we identify as the most prominent minister? Go ahead, name. Charles Finney, right? Then we talked about the actual reforms that came out of the Second Great Awakening and during this time period. And we talked about treatment of the mentally ill. And who did we associate that I widely admire with treatment of the mentally ill and promoting that? Yes. Dorothea Dix, who founds those mental institutions. We also talked about, the temperance movement, the American Temperance Society. We talked about Lyman Beecher and temperance as the most far-reaching of all the reform movements. There's also a random question on our test about something called the Hudson River School of Painting. Now, you might laugh at the Hudson River School of Painting, but it is almost consistently on the AP test. Now, here's, in your textbook, if you were to read it, I'm sure you won't, but if you were, in your textbook there is a discussion of how culture was impacted by the transformation. So when you talk about culture, you usually talk about what reflects culture. And what reflects culture are the arts. Paintings, sculpture, music, literature. These are the things that reflect, to some extent, who we are. And one of the arguments was, and this is made in your book, and if you read it, you know this, but I'm sure you won't, but one of the arguments was, in the aftermath of the War of 1812, what starts to emerge is a distinctive American culture, right? Prior to that time, Americans are groping with being former colonies. Look, the first president who is born under an American flag is Van Buren. So that Americans are largely dominated by being part of the British Empire. And remember, we said the War of 1812 was a second war of independence in a lot of ways. One of the ways is that what starts to emerge with this spirit of nationalism is an American culture that is reflected, and if you read chapter 15 in your text, is reflected by all of these writers, of whom we only discuss the transcendentalists, they being Emerson and Thoreau. But it's also reflected in art. And one of the reflections is the Hudson River School. Because what the Hudson River School painters painted was landscapes. What defined America? Open spaces, opportunity, right? And so the AP loves the Hudson River School. There might be a question on this about that, right? Now, when we get into chapter 16 in your text, and this would just be a moment, the things that we talked about in class are almost exclusively abolition. Chapter 16 in your text is a discussion of the South and slavery. There's a lot of discussion in there about the demographics of slavery, none of which we discuss, right? Now, when I talk about the demographics, and this is why I'm recommending that you read that chapter, when I talk about the demographics of slavery, what we're talking about is who owned the slaves, where were the slaves at, what did the slaves do, right? If people didn't own slaves, what did they do? Now, what you might have gleaned from today is that if you had a cotton plantation, in all likelihood, you owned slaves that worked on that plantation. But the overwhelming majority of people in the South did not own cotton plantations. So if the overwhelming majority of people in the South did not own cotton plantations, did they own slaves? And the answer is no. Most people in the South did not own slaves, right? So, okay, if they didn't own slaves, and they didn't own cotton plantations, what did they do? You know, and I think the discussion of that in your text is sort of an important one, but it seems simple to say in the South, there was not industry, right? There wasn't really an industrial revolution in the South because industry is not going to be able to compete with cotton growing, right? Most people in the South, whether they owned a large plantation or whether they were a small farmer, were just that, farmers, right? The South clung to the agrarian lifestyle. Immigrants, Irish immigrants didn't go to the South. Logically, they would not go to the South because how could an impoverished Catholic Irish immigrant compete with slave labor, right? So if I'm an Irish immigrant and I'm going to take the most menial job that I can get just to get enough money to bring my family over from Ireland, I'm going to be more likely to be able to acquire that job in a place where people don't own slaves and can rent those slaves out to other people, which they did. I own slaves on a plantation, but I don't need all my slaves, but this business owner in the town needs slaves to work in their business or needs labor. I rented their labor to other people. So immigrants aren't going to go to the South. Industry isn't going to go to the South. So the South and what it is and the role of slavery in the South is going to be different. Now the only thing that we talked about was abolition. And tomorrow we are going to talk in more detail about the responses to the radical abolition movement. Now let me just reinforce that before we leave. Now we said that in class, but the kids don't pay attention, they text. Not you, Marissa, the other kids, bad kids. 8th period, right? You know, I mean, text, right? So in class, we said the radical abolition movement meant that they were advocating for the immediate, uncompensated end to slavery. So immediately, without compensation and without colonization. When Calhoun, and I read Calhoun today, when Calhoun thunders, abolition and union cannot coexist, the abolition he's talking about is the abolition that came from the pen of William Lloyd Garrison. What was the name of his newspaper? We said it today? The Liberator. Yes, go ahead, Nate.
No compensation, no colonization,
Not gradually. Okay, so there you go. On this test, there will be a short free response, like we did on the first test. So there will be a short free response on this test, in addition to the multiple choice questions. Okay, that's it for today. Well, that's good. Garrett, that worked out. When we put it on?
That's going on right now.
The man's what's uploaded to the YouTube right now. How can Garrett? How can anybody do
The
more
pay by
value?
tomorrow, $3, right?
Mr. Wallace, don't leave yet. Oh, pass some crackers.
Swimming. Swimming.